Okay, so I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this panel, and I already gave you the description. We're going to focus on the conflict in Ukraine, and I'm going to start with Ambassador Sales. Ambassador, you worked at the State Department in several high-profile roles. I mentioned your role as Undersecretary. I mentioned your work as a coordinator for counterterrorism at the U.S. Department of State. Now, we are now in the second year of the conflict. What are the implications for international stability going on for this next year or two if this continues?
Well, Jason, thanks for the question, and thanks everybody for being here. I think this is a really important question because we actually don't want to have to answer it. We actually don't want this conflict to drag on for several years. Ukraine has been in a frozen conflict with Russia for almost a decade now, beginning with the 2014 illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine's eastern regions. A long conflict favors Russia. An immediate, decisive victory for Ukraine is what the United States and the West and our partners around the world should be pushing for, in my opinion. And let's be clear what this is about. The reason Russia unleashed a war of conquest, a war of imperialism in Ukraine, is because Vladimir Putin is trying to relitigate the Soviet Empire's loss of the Cold War. And he has said publicly that the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. You know, I might rank a couple other things higher on the list, but to each his own, I guess. But I think we can take him at his word that he sees the fall of the Soviet Empire as a catastrophe that is to be relitigated. This is not, in other words, about Nazis in Ukraine. Nobody could reasonably think that. This is not about NATO somehow posing a threat to Russia. Nobody could reasonably think that. This is all about Russia trying to restore its faded glory. Our interest in the United States and in NATO and in our global alliances is to deny Putin what he seeks. We want Ukraine to be free and independent and sovereign, and we want it to win. And this is where I think I would differ somewhat from the approach that the administration has pursued. I think the administration deserves a great deal of credit for providing a certain amount of military assistance to Kyiv and deserves a certain amount of credit for deploying a range of sanctions tools. Jason, this is your wheelhouse more than anybody else's, a range of sanctions tools against Moscow. But we're really fighting with one hand behind our back. The strategy we have been pursuing is one that has given Ukraine just enough to not lose, but not enough to win decisively. And so I would like to see the administration really amplify the military assistance that has been provided. Initially we heard, well, we can't provide, we can't provide Stingers. We'll provide javelins, but not Stingers. And then, okay, we'll provide Stingers, but we're not going to provide long-range artillery such as HIMARS systems. Okay, we'll provide HIMARS systems, but we're going to disable the functionality that would allow them to fire longer-range rockets. Oh, and we're not going to send ATACMS, and also no tanks. Okay, we'll send tanks, but now we're not going to send F-16s. And at each point, I think the administration has unhelpfully signaled a reluctance to arm Ukraine with tools that it needs out of a misplaced fear of Russian escalation. Well, we now have data. We now have a year's worth of data, and every time the administration has eventually done the right thing, what have we seen from Russia? Nothing but battlefield losses. We have not seen escalation from Russia. We've seen battlefield losses from Russia. And so I would humbly encourage the administration to learn the right lesson from that pattern and provide Ukraine what it needs to win and to win fast.
I think that's a great setup to move from some of the conventional aspects of the war in Ukraine Ambassador Sales mentioned, which is clearly going very poorly for the Russian Federation. Dr. Lilly, I'd like to have your opinion on this. How would you describe how Russia is leveraging other tools at its disposal? For instance, much has been made of the fact that the Russians haven't been particularly effective in deploying other tools like its cyber warfare arsenal, for instance. And a lot of us were thinking we would see a lot more of that, but we haven't seen as much. What's going on there? Why hasn't Russia been effective at using its cyber tools?
First, I would like to say that the fact that we haven't seen more disruptive, successful cyber attacks that the Russian government has launched against Ukrainian targets doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have the capability to do so, or that they haven't actively attacked Ukrainian targets. Actually, this is the first war where we see cyberspace being so actively leveraged by both sides. And recently, as Nathan mentioned, we marked the 1-year anniversary of the war, or this new escalation of the war since February 2022. And there have been a number of reports by cyber threat intelligence companies and IT companies that collect and analyze telemetry from Ukrainian networks. And they unanimously conclude that we have seen an increase in the intensity and frequency of cyber operations that have been launched by Russian state actors or affiliated cyber groups against Ukrainian targets. And there is one report I would like to highlight specifically. That's the report that recently was published actually last week by Ukraine's CERT. CERT is their Computer Emergency Response Team. And it's the very first report that they've ever published, and it analyzes the evolution of Russia's cyber attacks against Ukraine and the types of attacks that Ukraine's CERT has responded to. And in this report, they clearly state that at first, in the beginning, in the initial stages of the war, the Russian cyber threat actors were very much focused on trying to attack media and telecommunication providers and that infrastructure, and then they shifted towards attacking more the energy sector, which also follows their military strategy. Another thing that's really interesting from that report is Ukraine's CERT has managed 2,194 cases of cyber incidents from Russian cyber threat actors against Ukrainian targets in 2022. This is quite a significant number. And in the report, they say that they have manually managed those incidents, and I actually reached out to them to ask what that means, because it was a language that I haven't encountered before. And they explained to me that those are attacks that were so sophisticated that they required a member of their CERT to actually manually intervene and investigate and mitigate the attack. But if they have to count all these attacks that they have mitigated through automated tools in addition to humans, or human in the loop, they're close to 7,000. And these are just the attacks that Ukraine's CERT has dealt with, which is quite significant. We have other reports from Google, Mandiant, Microsoft that recently came out that showed that phishing campaigns against Ukrainian targets from Russia have increased to 250% in 2022. And what's even more interesting, or also interesting to me, is that the same report also showed that phishing campaigns against NATO members that are supporting Ukraine have increased by 300% in 2022, which shows you just the vast activity that's been happening in cyberspace. We also have a lot of disruptive attacks, specifically using wiper malware and DDoS attacks that the Russian government has launched. And in the first 4 months of the war, they launched more of those attacks that they had in the previous 8 years combined. So that's quite an increase. But you are right that the international community in general expected to see more success from the Russians. And a good question is then, okay, why, despite the fact that they've been trying, why didn't we see them being more successful? Well, they were almost successful in a number of cases, and they could have wreaked massive havoc on Ukraine. But first, the Ukrainian government was prepared. They have been fighting Russia in cyberspace since at least 2014, since the annexation of Crimea. And second, we saw massive amounts of support from the IT community worldwide, specifically the Western world. Microsoft, Google, Mandiant, ESET, they have helped Ukraine significantly since the beginning of the war and have mitigated some massive cyber attacks that could have had very significant impact.
I'd love to follow up on this line. So, Russia is using its cyber tools, perhaps not to the extent that many assume it would. Ukraine is very sophisticated based on a long period of experience dating back to 2014 of dealing with Russian-related cyber intrusions. The West, Silicon Valley companies, Microsoft you mentioned specifically, have stepped forward to try to assist Ukraine. All this under the backdrop of the beginning of the war during 2022. Do you project analytically that Russia will step up its game this year as the conflict draws on in the cyberspace? And if you think that's the case, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, what kinds of cyber attacks should we be ready to see from the Russians?
That's such a great question. And I've talked to cybersecurity experts who have eyes on the ground, and they argue in the opposite directions. Some say the Russians burned a lot of their tools early on in the war because they didn't expect to be at war for that long. So we're unlikely to see any significant change in their behavior in cyberspace, just a lot of the same. But there are others who very strongly believe that the Russian government is holding back, their cyber forces are holding back some of their infrastructure and plan to deploy it in a period of conventional military escalation of the war. So recently, I've had some information that the Russian government has likely been posting recruitment messages on offensive forums where they're trying to recruit for their hacking force. So this would suggest that they're either experiencing challenges scaling up or they're basically running out of talent. But then also there are two aspects to this. One is what types of cyber operations we could see against Ukraine and what types of cyber operations we could see against the West. Because I do believe that as the Russians are more challenged in the conventional domain during the war in Ukraine, they're most likely to try to retaliate against the West to reduce the unity in the West among the Western countries for support for Ukraine and for a number of other reasons. And I think the types of operations we're likely to see are disruptive attacks like DDoS attacks, for example, and wiper malware, but also ransomware attacks. And we've also seen evolution in ransomware strategies. Before, there was this known term double extortion, where the ransomware threat actors will encrypt the files of an organization, and also while they're in the networks of the organization, they will also extract those files and threaten to release them to the public. But now, in order to basically increase the pressure on the organization to provide to provide ransom so that they can decrypt the files. But now we're also seeing the ransomware threat actors going back to the organization and saying that they know who are the users of the data that they stole, and they will also reach back to those users, tell them that they stole their data, and even assist them with finding legal support to sue the company that the ransomware threat actors have targeted. So there's this triple extortion method that's happening at the moment. So I imagine a lot of those types of operations are what we're going to see. And a final point on this that I wanted to make. When the Russian government retaliates against Western states, they don't just do that in cyberspace, and they not only use cyber operations and disinformation operations, influence operations as we know them, they also use far-right movements. They try to stage protests in different countries. One of the most recent examples is Moldova. So I think the retaliation against Western countries that are supporting Ukraine will be a mix of all these different malicious activities.
I think that's a perfect segue to Dr. Rekawek, this notion of using proxies. Dr. Rekawek, one of your areas of specialization is examining the activities of non-state actors. And I think there has been some surprise amongst us, for instance, that we haven't seen perhaps the influx of so-called foreign fighters into the current conflict that we observed perhaps in 2014. In which, of course, there is the hybrid war that Russia alleges they had nothing to do with, but there's no question that you have a lot of little green men running around probably with the Russian military. But there was a component to 2014 where there was a very heavy non-state actor focus. What's the picture look like? And in 2014, we had the Ukrainian volunteer battalions, we had some separatist militia movements, you had activities associated with the Wagner Group in the very early days of 2014 when that group was founded. What's the picture look like now with non-state actor activity in 2022, 2023?
Thank you for the question, Jason, and thank you for the earlier comments. I'll put it this way. Both Nathan and Bilyana spoke about situations in which Russia kind of failed. I'd like to bring up one in which it succeeded. Back in 2014, it kind of convinced most of us that this is a hybrid war, that it has nothing to do with it, that this is some kind of a civil war really, and it's about the Russian-speaking community in eastern Ukraine, that someone needs to step in and defend it. And quite a few people, especially in the West, and not only in the West, in the global South, believed that. Now, the classic case, as you mentioned, is that we form militias. Militias can attract anyone. They can attract foreigners. They can attract loose cannon from the West, if I could put it this way. On the Ukrainian side, as you said, Jason, We have the volunteer battalions, which is the kind of classic Ukrainian way of a bottom-up organization. Like, the state is here, we will organize because the state does not provide for us. But that was 9 years ago. The change is almost complete in a way. Now what you're seeing on the Ukrainian side is essentially concerned citizens of the world flocking to help it. Not just the fighters, but also people who train the Ukrainian fighters, but also there's a huge community of humanitarians / logisticians who provide all sorts of stuff for Ukrainian frontline units, non-lethal equipment, they evacuate people, so you have this kind of whole community. Now, the continuity here is that some people who were there in 2014, on both sides, so you had Rusich Maneuver Group on the Russian side, Russian imperial movement, they were there in 2014, they're back now. On the Ukrainian side, those old volunteer battalions that used to be there, they're also back. Georgian National Legion, right sector, Azov, they're again fighting. And again, you have people, individuals who were there in 2014 who returned. So that gives us, a pause for thought, if I could put it this way, that you can be a career foreign fighter if you're in this business. You don't do it once, you return back and forth. So I guess that's the change. It's more structured, it's state-owned. Ukraine owns this mobilization now of foreigners because it called upon them to come over. In 2014, it did not. Russia has its own problems. It promises 50,000 Syrians, that many thousand from Sahelian Africa. Not many have actually turned up, but there are foreigners in the ranks as well, and as you mentioned, in the beloved Wagner Group as well.
I want to pick up on this, Dr. Rekawek. You mentioned Azov. I'd like to pull that thread a little bit. Of course, the justification to go into Ukraine, of course, is to supposedly denazify Ukraine. And in 2014, there is evidence, of course, that Azov has elements within it that embrace Nazism. How would you say Azov's evolved over these last 9 years specifically? You've been on the ground, and you talked a little bit about how elements of these various battalions have been subsumed into the Ukrainian state. So how is that working as it relates to some of the perhaps more problematic ideological tenets of some individuals within the broader Azov movement?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think, how does it work? It's a very short leash. And when Ukraine has this approach of if you're fighting, and I might not like exactly your views, but as long as you're fighting well, we can keep you there. And I think the evolution of Azov, Jason, easiest thing. Many people, and I think I'll put my hands up, we're trying to build them up into this kind of transnational violent movement. Now, Azov regiment that fought in Mariupol, and hundreds of its members are now in Russian captivity. I interviewed some who went through this captivity, and it was a horrendous ordeal, just let me put it this way. The people, the regiment that was under siege in Mariupol had two Westerners in its ranks. Whereas I think we build it up into something that it was not. Nowadays, Azov is three things. One is the regiment that is trying to reconstitute itself, mostly sitting in Russian prisons, let's be honest. The second one is the socio-political movement built around a political party called the National Core, which is a far-right political party. We have them everywhere. In all the Western European countries, you have a far-right political party that's anti-democratic, and that doesn't like the LGBT community, doesn't like liberalism, etc., etc., etc. So this is it. And the third item is the new unit that this political party tries to influence, which is the 3rd Assault Brigade, which groups all the old Azov veterans who left the regiment at some point. Now, will they be successful? I'm not so sure. Time will tell, but I think if we talk about this regiment, the original battalion, and then regiment as this kind of, core of white supremacy transnational structure, it has never been that. And as I said, I'll put my hands up and, confess a bit. But at the same time, it's definitely not there. It actually argues with the Azov movement saying, don't use our logo. It uses separate funding channels for its fighters. So actually that tells you quite a lot that not so much love is there between them. So I guess we can chill a bit on this front.
I like that. Let's chill. So I want to shift. We've mentioned Wagner a few times, but I want to kind of dig a little deeper on Wagner. Ambassador Sales, one of your old jobs was being the coordinator for counterterrorism, the bureau at the State Department that's charged with recommending groups to be designated by the Secretary of State. I myself have been tracking the Wagner Group for quite some time. There is a lot of international interest about what to do against the Wagner Group. I testified on Capitol Hill recently in front of a bicameral mix of senators and representatives who are exploring whether or not the Wagner Group should be designated as a terrorist group. And in Britain, there are reports that the United Kingdom may soon prescribe the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization. Can you tell us a little bit about the Wagner Group? And as one of the senior officials at the Department of State charged with sanctioning groups in the past, should Wagner be sanctioned as a terrorist group, and will it have any effect on it, if it were?
So a couple of thoughts on that, Jason. I guess the first thing I'd say is people have gotten themselves sanctioned for a lot less than what Wagner has credibly been accused of doing over the course of the war in Ukraine. And I think the first thing you need to know about Wagner starts with the name. It's named after Richard Wagner, who was Hitler's favorite composer. We speak about the risks of far-right, white supremacist fighters fighting for Ukraine. I think that risk is dramatically overstated. I quite agree with you. And really the elephant in the room is that the Kremlin's proxies in Ukraine are themselves tainted by neo-Nazi ideology and white supremacist theory. The founder of Wagner, Dmitry Utkin, has an SS tattoo. That doesn't sound anti-Nazi to me. The Russian imperial movement, another Russian proxy that is actively fighting on behalf of the Kremlin in Ukraine, and perhaps, according to press reports, responsible for a series of letter bombs in Spain, including one directed at the US Embassy. The Russian imperial movement was the first white supremacist terrorist group ever designated by the State Department. Its activities don't sound anti-Nazi to me. So if Wagner or other of these proxies were to be subjected to various terrorism sanctions, what would the consequences be? Well, Wagner is already under a number of US sanctions as a transnational criminal organization. Generally, these sorts of measures aim to cut organizations off from the international financial system, impose secondary sanctions on banks or other third parties that might help these entities evade our sanctions. So Wagner is already in the vice, as it were, when it comes to US financial pressure. If you were to put them on the list of designated foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs, that's a specialized term of art. It's sort of the gold standard when it comes to terrorism sanctions. There's several other sanctions regimes. That would add additional pressure in a couple of different ways. The first thing it would do is, if Wagner is designated as a foreign terrorist organization, that would make it a federal crime for any person to knowingly provide material support or resources to Wagner. What that does is it makes an organization completely radioactive. The risk associated with transacting any sort of business whatsoever with a designated FTO is really off the charts. Several years ago, the State Department placed Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on the list of designated FTOs. And the fallout from that in terms of the IRGC's ability to engage in ordinary business transactions was, I think, dramatic. And you could envision a similar effect for Wagner. A second major piece of pressure that I'll highlight before turning it over, if Wagner were designated as an FTO, US citizens who have been injured in attacks committed by Wagner would then have the ability to file a private lawsuit, not just against Wagner, excuse me, but against some of those third parties, those private businesses that have assisted Wagner. So airline catering companies that have serviced planes flying Wagner mercenaries into conflict zones, banks that have processed Wagner transactions, hotels that have accommodated Wagner fighters. All of those entities would potentially be subject to civil lawsuits for providing assistance to Wagner as an FTO. That's another way in which these terrorism sanctions authorities can really make an organization radioactive and cause legitimate businesses to recoil from engaging with them in any way.
I want to stick to this theme of the Wagner Group, and I want to pick up on a point, Dr. Lilly, you had mentioned in your last response on the brain drain that we're seeing out of Moscow in the tech space. And you're probably aware in November of 2022, the head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, created this tech center in St. Petersburg as part of an effort to have more of a domestic presence in Russia. Obviously, Wagner's projected its power not only in Ukraine, although it's been really good at having its members get killed primarily, but also in places like Africa. Do you think Wagner could be an effective component to the larger cyber infrastructure to essentially stave off the brain drain that's happening, where so many people in Russia have left because they don't want to fight what they see as an unjust war? Is this something we need to worry about as it relates to Wagner?
Given the level of expertise required to become an actual hacker and be effective in the cyberspace, I don't think that's a solution that we'll see results from anytime soon. Also, I'm very skeptical when I see any sort of new tech initiative starting in Russia. They have had a history of starting tech initiatives, starting with Skolkovo, and I've been there, it was like a desert. They start those initiatives, there's a lot of hype around them, and then not a lot of actual results. So I'm very skeptical. I don't think that is going to impact the brain drain in any major way.
All right, so I want to kind of stick with this Wagner theme, Kacper, and kind of ask you, you have your contacts, your interlocutors on the ground in Ukraine. What are they saying about Wagner's activities in Ukraine? Are they effective, ineffective? I mean, we read in Western press, we're talking upwards to 50,000 members who are part of Wagner, some who have willingly joined, others who have been coerced, those that have essentially been scooped up out of prisons and thrown to the front lines, and by all appearances, getting killed on the front lines. Multiple Biden administration officials have called the Wagner going through essentially the equivalent of a meat grinder. Is Wagner doing anything effective on the ground based on your interactions with interlocutors? What's the word on the street as it relates to their activities?
Thank you, Jason. The word on the street amongst the foreign fighters that I spoke to is the following. At first, they were interested in facing Wagner because they felt, okay, this is the crack Russian unit, and we will face it, and we shall see what they're made of. So that was the initial word on the street. And I said, well, okay, you let me know how it goes. All these guys who mentioned that, they all survived, and then they said, well, they're a joke, because they've recruited too many people. When you have inflation, the value of every item decreases. So essentially, they were really like, I don't mind these guys because they're useless. But then came the third. And the third word on the street, if I could put it this way, is that we're tired because of the meat grinder that you described. They're throwing people at us in Western Front World War I style. And at some point, literally, when you hear fighters say, like, look, my machine gun jammed because I was firing too much at too rapid of a sequence, they were also saying, look, this is useless for them, but it tires you as a defender. It affects your, psychological reactions, so to speak. So maybe, if that's the way for the, master chef of Putin to actually do this, maybe that's the way, maybe that's how they cooked it up. But I think, in terms of effectiveness, it's not getting anywhere. But one point, yes, I think sanctioning them going on the FTO, it's actually a good idea because they do operate internationally. They try to recruit internationally. They had this video for American members. I don't know if you've seen it, which I think, I then asked the American foreign fighters how they viewed it. And I said, look, I was brought up on Red Dawn movie, the one with Patrick Swayze when the Americans are fighting Russians, and now they expect me to join the Russians. I won't. So this video kind of backfired. But they do try to go into these new spaces, and for this reason, well, they need a big slap on their hands, yes.
And I think this is a really interesting point, Kacper. The propaganda aspects associated with the Wagner Group, I think is fascinating. They've made movies. You can actually go to the Internet Movie Database and look up some of the Wagner productions, and the fact that they're able to disseminate that kind of propaganda, that it actually gets ratings on this aggregator that evaluates films, to me is very disturbing. One of the benefits I've witnessed in my career is that quite often when you do sanction a group, and we have like 2 pros for the designation camp of Wagner as a terrorist organization here, and I imagine, Dr. Lilly, you probably would look at them as a terrorist group too, is the fact that you mentioned the propaganda. I'm very familiar with some of the propaganda over social media. Is when the Trump administration designated the Russian imperial movement on April 6th of 2020, on April 7th of 2020, some of the Russian imperial movement social media sites on Facebook, the YouTube channel, they were gone by the 7th of April. And I think treating an organization like that as a terrorist group may have impact on social media companies' determinations as it relates to content associated with the group, and taking away perhaps an important propaganda component, but also a component of their ability to recruit. So I think that's an excellent point. And I kind of want to shift to you, Dr. Lilly, because your specialization, of course, is disinformation. Yevgeny Prigozhin in 2016, is essentially the head of the master troll farm that was engaged in trying to peddle disinformation in the 2016 election. It's been well documented. Russia more broadly very engaged in disinformation operations. How do you see Russian disinformation operations being deployed overseas right now? And do you think they've been effective in trying to change political opinion about the war that they started? And how are they doing that? Are they trying to create wedges within society, and are they effective at polarization?
Absolutely, it's a great question, Jason. So, since the beginning of the war, the traditional channels through which they had broadcasted disinformation have been significantly impacted in the West. We have from legislation that has been introduced by the European Union, for example. European Union banned RT and Sputnik, which are the two main Russian state-sponsored media channels, and they also have websites. In the States, we have a number of IT companies that manage some of the major platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and they have significantly restricted the reach of RT and Sputnik and other Russian media, and they're actively taking down fake accounts that spread propaganda and disinformation from the Russian government. They're identifying them and taking them down. There have been quite a few good reports about this. But the Russian government has adapted, unfortunately. They're using their embassies and state officials a lot more to spread disinformation. They're also creating new websites through which they are disseminating disinformation. And in Eastern and Central Europe, they're especially working with actual journalists and well-established media that have existed in those countries for decades to spread their message. Another development that we've seen is that they're using diaspora in different countries. And I know this from about a week ago from a very reputable source. They're using a lot of activists in different countries that are actually either Russian citizens or they're paying directly to stage protests and cause disturbance in different Western countries. Specifically in the West, the aim is to make sure that we lose our unity and we stop supporting Ukraine and we shift our focus. Because the moment we shift our focus away from Ukraine, the moment we forget that there's a war, public support is going to decline. And we've done this before. We have media cycles, and keeping attention on one topic for that long is really difficult. So they're trying to start other crises in different European countries so that we pay attention to them and shift our focus away from Ukraine, like in Moldova. Recently there was this information that there was a plan for a coup in Moldova that was created by the Russians, and it was intercepted by Ukrainian intelligence, and they sent it to the Moldovan government. And recently there were protests in Moldova that were linked to that plan from the Russian government. And some of the protesters were actually Russian citizens. They were protesting in Moldova, supposedly against the Moldovan government. So the Russians have a history of that, and there was even a failed coup in Montenegro. They tried to kill the prime minister of Montenegro in 2016 after an election when Montenegro was deciding to join NATO or not. And there were also GRU members that sponsored the protesters. GRU, that's Russian military intelligence. So literally Russians trying to stage coups in our own backyard. Since the beginning of the war, we've also seen the Russians expanding their disinformation efforts in the so-called global south. So Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and they're doing this through RT Sputnik and Sputnik, the state-sponsored channels, and through other media. And they have increased their coverage in Spanish, Arabic, and in some of the other languages. For example, RT Arabic has right now more than 80 million viewers. And they're actually, through RT Arabic, you have a lot of the same documentaries that they show about the Wagner Group on RT, that they're liberators, the Ukraine doesn't have the right to exist and all of that. And you have a lot of actual citizens of different countries watching this. And the main objective in the global south is to erode the reputation of the West and make sure that the support that already exists for Russia is maintained and is increased.
I want to shift to taking more the macro look at the world. Ambassador Sales, you mentioned things that the Biden administration should be thinking about, keying in and zoning in on this concept of incrementalism. Some have talked about in terms of how the United States has provided in incremental fashion, in a methodical, slow fashion, slower than you would probably like fashion, armaments. There's been a slow push over time and how sanctions have been deployed against the Russian Federation. Now, what do you think more the Biden administration can do, particularly as we think about the backdrop of this entire conference, which is reshaping global order? And this, I think, picks up on Dr. Lilly's point that where we're seeing a lot of Russian influence operations happening in places like Africa, for instance, and we've seen a number of United Nations votes where there have been a number of interesting abstentions of countries in which we've seen people like Lavrov go visit, and we've seen South Africa most recently having some interactions at a bilateral level, at a very high level with the Russian state. We've, of course, seen China not condemn the war in Ukraine. We have seen China-based satellite imagery companies provide imagery to the Wagner Group, and those companies have been sanctioned by the U.S. Department of Treasury. We have seen a number of countries serve as nodes to facilitate financial transactions related to the Russian Federation. It seems like we have this global reshaping of an order happening here, that the Russians are finding some allies. And what more can the United States, the European Union, United Kingdom, and other countries do to counter that reshaping that the Russians have been engaged in?
Yeah, great question. I think if I had an hour, I could answer it adequately, maybe. I'll try and compress it into just a soundbite or two. So I think the first thing, the Biden administration isn't paying me for my advice, so I'll offer it for free, and you get what you pay for. I guess the first thing I would say is there's 3 or 4 course corrections that I would suggest. 1, more military assistance. 2, increased sanctions pressure. And then 3/4, domestic messaging and public diplomacy. I've already talked about the military assistance. Bottom line, Ukraine needs to be provided with the weapons it needs to win the war, and to win the war quickly. I agree, the longer this war progresses, the more fractures are going to emerge in our domestic politics, the more fissures are going to be exploited in the Western alliance and in our global partnership. So it is not in our interest for there to be a protracted conflict. Fight to win now. Sanctions pressure, on a scale of 1 to 10, I think we're probably at about a 2 or a 3. The president said he wanted to turn the ruble into rubble. It's actually not rubble, it's rebounded this year. It's more, I don't know if it's more valuable today than it was in February of 2021, but it's at least close. And I think the markets are reflecting the fact that the West really has been fighting with one hand behind its back. We haven't sanctioned the Russian energy sector. When it comes to the financial sector, we've cherry-picked a handful of banks. We have created a general license which expressly exempts energy-related payments from sanctions, financial sanctions that otherwise would apply. We have not really imposed sweeping secondary sanctions to ensure that other countries are not able to go behind our back and evade the sanctions that we have put in place. So I think we need to dial that up. I don't know whether we go to 10 or 11, but maintaining a low simmer of 2 or 3 on the scale is not going to be adequate. And then finally, the broad category of messaging, I think, is really important. For our domestic politics, it's really important, I think, for the administration to explain why Ukraine matters, and to explain what our strategy is and what our theory of victory is. It's not enough to talk about authoritarianism versus democracy. That's important. I believe in that. But it's not adequate. It's not adequate to talk about the rules-based international order. If you say rules-based international order at a restaurant in Canton, Ohio, where I'm from, people get out their translator to figure out what you're saying, because it just doesn't translate into Ohio. You have to put this in terms of American national interest and American values. So I would like to see a more fulsome explanation from the administration about why this matters. And you can make the case, right? If a Republican like me is cheerleading for the Biden administration to do more, right, you can very easily persuade gettable voters in the United States about why this matters. And then finally, when it comes to public diplomacy, I think it's really important for the administration and for the Western world to make the case to the global South, or whatever you want to call this group of states that are sort of caught in between this tug of war between the Russian world and its ally. Russia doesn't have allies. The Russian world and the United States and our allies. Look, this is a war of imperialism, right? If your country has suffered from imperialism, you understand as well as anybody what Ukraine is experiencing right now. And I think that is a message that the Western world really needs to be putting forward to explain what's at stake here. A state, in the same way that we rightfully deplore some of the imperial excesses committed by Western European powers in the 19th and 20th centuries. Like, we don't have to look at the history books for examples of imperial atrocities. They're happening right now. They're happening right now in Ukraine, and they're happening by Russia. And any state that has experienced the scourge of colonialism and imperialism should not be signing up with Moscow.
I think that's a great transition. We're down to the last 5 minutes, and my notes say I should leave a minute or two to each panelist to say something profound. So no pressure. Any last observations? Kacper, I'm going to start with you, then to Dr. Lilly and to Ambassador Sales. Dr. Rekawek, any last observations you want to share with the room about the conflict in Ukraine that you haven't had an opportunity to speak to yet?
Yeah, I'll be the devil's advocate, because we were talking about this needs to be quick so Ukraine wins. Let's put it on its head. The longer it goes, the more dire the situation in Russia is. And we talk a lot about, especially the people from the US side in the audience here. The American far right talks a lot about Boogaloo, the second civil war, the second revolution and stuff like that. And we all worry that there's going to be a tidal wave of terrorist attacks coming from the far right in the US or Western Europe, for the Boogaloo. Well, guess what? There's going to be a Boogaloo, but it's going to be in Russia. And it will happen. This is the far right that killed 500 people in Russia between 2000 and 2017. 500, but you've never heard of it. Everyone knows about Breivik. I'm coming from Norway. Everyone knows about this attack. Everyone hears about attacks in the United States and Germany. Nobody knows how strong the milieu in Russia is. And guess what? They don't like how it's going now. And if Russia loses slowly, the rot creeps in, they will come back with vengeance. And guess what? That's the last point. If they do their Boogaloo, and it's going to happen anyway, but they turn around and start calling our guys to come and assist us, because here's a chance to do these mass atrocities that you all dreamed of, and now you can do them in Russia. We need to have a policy for that. But one thing, it is happening in some way, shape, or form anyway. We cannot stop it. It's down to Russia. They launched it onto themselves.
All right, so taking the contrarian perspective in a lot of ways, that the longer this goes, the more it's going to impact Russia perhaps than Ukraine, for instance. So Dr. Lilly, any last words you want to leave our audience?
Yes, I want to applaud the international community, specifically the Western world, for all the support that they have provided to Ukraine, the IT companies that have voluntarily stepped in, which has the amount of help and the fact that they've done this publicly has been unprecedented. And I want to encourage them to continue to support Ukraine, because this war is existential to Ukraine. And if we let Russia win, it is not going to stop at Ukraine. That's the major point I wanted to leave everyone with.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lilly. Ambassador Sales, you get the last word.
Last word, pressure's on. Xi Jinping is watching. I think what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. The implications for the global order are massive, depending on what happens over the next 1 to 2 to 3 years in Ukraine. If Putin suffers a humiliating defeat, I think Xi Jinping thinks twice about whether the People's Liberation Army is capable of mounting an even more complex operation to seize Taiwan. If, on the other hand, Putin is able to divide the West, and we see a weakening in support, military support, if we see a weakening in political support from the Western world and our partners globally, if we see that sanctions begin to be lifted or we maintain the status quo, Xi Jinping is going to think, I can outlast him too. So Ukraine matters for its own sake, but it also matters with respect to the United States' principal geopolitical challenge, and that is confronting a revanchist China. Freudian slip.
And actually, I was jumping the gun a little bit. We do actually have a few more moments. I do want to pick up another thread very quickly. So you've said all your profound things, but I'm going to put some pressure on you to say something profound again. You know, one thing I worry about, and some of you have intimated this. Dr. Lilly, you've intimated this. Ambassador Sales, you've intimated this in the context of trying to explain to an Ohioan why Ukraine matters. You know, when long conflicts, you know, continue on and there is no visible potential outcome or resolution to that conflict, publics become numb to the conflict. And I'd be keen to hear your various perspectives, perhaps starting with Ambassador Sales and then going to Dr. Lilly, then to Dr. Rekawek, on what more can we do to ensure that that numbing that quite often grips us when we're just at a point where, you know, we want to move on from the news cycle and get into something new. You know, what can we do from a public diplomacy perspective, from a public relations perspective, from a perspective of communicating with other countries to really see some of the horrors that are happening in Ukraine, and that these aren't things that we can just forget?
Right. I think part of the answer to that is you have to explain why Ukraine matters to the average American, and part of that answer is Russia is our adversary. How do we know that? Well, because Putin has told us so. And by the way, the Russian Federation has however many megatons worth of nuclear missiles aimed at the United States right now. They're not our friend. We can take Putin at his word when he says that he sees the United States and our partners as implacable foes. And I think part of the case that you have to make to the American people and to other populations around the world is this is a good investment. This is not America's fight. This is not NATO's fight. We're not going to commit blood to this conflict, but we can commit treasure. And it's actually not all that much. You know, the amount of military support we've been providing, you know, the United States has provided far and away the most, followed then, I think, by the UK, and Germany's in third place. It's a drop in the bucket compared to our defense budgets. It's not nothing. There are opportunity costs, but I think those opportunity costs are small relative to the strategic payoff that they produce, and relative to you know, the costs we would bear from a world in which Ukraine collapsed immediately. The cost of living in that world would be incalculable. So I think we need to help. Part of the message that we need to convey to the American people, and you know, the messages probably differ in Western Europe, they probably differ in the Gulf, but I'll just speak parochially as an American here. I think the message the American people need to hear is we need to help Ukraine win so that we don't have to fight and die for Poland and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. Because I think you're exactly right. Putin's appetite will not be slackened if he succeeds in Ukraine. It will only whet his appetite. And guess who's next? It's countries that the United States is treaty bound to defend. So I would happily pay a couple $2 billion in military assistance today to help Ukraine defeat an invasion if the alternative is let the invasion succeed, and now we're talking about risk to American personnel in a shooting war in Poland or in the Baltics.
And as I think about, Dr. Lilly, your area of expertise and this challenge of the public becoming numb, what I've observed is Ukraine has been particularly effective on combating the Russians in the propaganda space. There was a really good, you know, if those of you are nerds like me read the War on the Rocks, there was a good piece about how the Americans may be able to learn from some of the things Ukraine's done in terms of leveraging influencers in the online space to fight this propaganda battle. Do you think that could be some way for us to you know, push forward narratives that allow for people not to become numb to this conflict?
Absolutely, Jason. And I wanted to first say I agree 100% with Nathan. And I have a practical recommendation, actionable recommendation for anyone who wants to help Ukraine and who wants to help to keep the public focused on Ukraine. Go on Twitter and join NAFA, the North Atlantic Fellow Organization. They're amazing. Shout out to them. If any of them are watching, I support them fully. They're a group of volunteers internationally all over the world that are using humor and sarcasm to fight Russian disinformation. There are a number of ambassadors, state officials that have joined them from different countries, and this is a way to try to maintain the focus on Ukraine. And I think they're doing an excellent job, and anyone who wants to join can. And they're a great example of how we can keep going. That would be the recommendation.
Wonderful, and I don't think people like we've been talking about Vladimir Putin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, they don't really particularly use humor effectively. So I think that's an area where there could be some advantage, right? Kacper, this is really a conflict that's close to home for you. You're a Polish native.
Yeah.
How do we keep Europe interested in this? Because Europe, it gets cold, and it has been cold in this winter, and there's some obviously very more direct impacts Europeans have felt than Americans. Are we at risk in Europe becoming numb to this conflict?
There is a risk, but hopefully it will not be, it will not fully transpire. I would say this, as every Pole, I have a history of Russian imperialism in my family, and, I had members of my family actually shot by the Soviet partisans a few years back. It was then Red Russia, and I was just called Russia. Remember, my country fought this war 100 years ago. It was Bolshevik Russia then, now it's just the Russian Federation, but, Russia is Russia, unfortunately. Sorry to say this. Now, what we can do, what we should be doing, I think, my region looks up to the United States, so I think Nathan worries too much about the United States. We actually like and get on with Americans. Americans are straightforward, just like us. You know what's black, what's white, and I think we can get on. But you need things like this. Chief of Staff of Polish Army, General Andrzejczak, was recently in the US, and he was doing the morning talk shows. That's a first in the history. You need stuff like that, and he came out beautifully on those talk shows. You need Lithuanian Chief of Staff, Estonian, Latvian. You need these guys out there. You need us, we need you, and we also need to be humble while convincing Western Europeans to chip in. For 15 to 20 years, I was always told in conferences like this one, oh, you're a Russophobe. And in 2022, I could turn around and just say, well, I've told you so, but I prefer not to do that. That's not the way to carry the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spanish with us. We need to be humble. Let's not push them too much. Let's work together as a coalition, and Ohio will be convinced that it actually makes sense. And if not, let's just play Red Dawn, and it will convince everybody that it's the same old enemy. We've been having this enemy for like 4 centuries. So and we've stuck around, and so will Ukraine, and so will everybody else. Don't worry.
So closing on a Red Dawn reference, which is a movie of uneven quality, I think, depending on the perspective you may have about your movies.
It's a masterpiece.
I want to thank my panelists for a fantastic conversation on the situation in Ukraine, the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine, and for sharing your perspectives today. Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.